What's up guys, I'm Sega Lord X, and in this episode we're going to be talking about the forgotten Sega arcade games. Now everybody remembers the popular stuff. The Golden Axes, the Virtua Fighters, the Daytonas. Everybody remembers a good Sega arcade game. But believe it or not, there are actually a ton of Sega arcade games that most people don't even know they existed. Most people have never even heard of most of these games. Most of the time when I bring up these games in casual conversation, most people have no clue what the hell I'm talking about. We're going to take a look at some of those games here. Let's get started. Arabian Fight was dropped in 1991 by Sega and was developed by the famed AM2 guys on the System 32 arcade board. This 4-player side-scrolling beat-em-up was one hell of a ride for fans of the genre. It had a number of similarities to Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, which included magic attacks that would clear an entire screen full of enemies, as well as 4-player co-op action. The graphical effects here were definitely the star, with a constantly scaling playfield, massive character sprites, and awesome hand-drawn animations for enemies entering the screen and the magic attacks. Gameplay would flow in classic beat-em-up style, but the addition of a guard to block enemy attacks added much needed depth. It could get repetitive by itself, and it was rare as rocking horse shit in the wild, but Arabian Fight was definitely worth a playthrough. AB Cop was a 1990 Japanese-only release done on the Sega X arcade hardware. AB stood for Air Bike, your machine of choice to run down criminals and their cronies. There's no great strategy here, just turn on the boosters and crash those bastards until they're all dead. Utilizing a superscaler engine similar to many of other Sega releases at the time, AB Cop is one beautiful experience. It's incredibly smooth and has a great sense of speed. The simplistic gameplay grows frustrating later in the game, as enemies take multiple hits to crash, making the game harder than it needs to be. The addition of a jump boost can help gameplay, but the limited number of uses means you'll want to save them for the boss fights. Outside of Japan, you have nearly a 0% chance of finding this one, but it plays fine on MAME with an analog controller. Released in 1993, Burning Rival was AM2's answer to Street Fighter. Unfortunately, the slow gameplay, generic characters, and terrible AI left a lot to be desired. The game was done on Sega's System 32 arcade hardware, but you wouldn't know it by looking at it. The muted art style and lack of visual flair didn't do the game any favors, though I do like the animations for the various characters. Fighting games were a dime a dozen after Street Fighter lit the genre on fire, and Sega's attempt here is a rare misfire for the company. Even Sega themselves lacked confidence in the game, choosing to leave it in Japan and cancel a worldwide release. This isn't the worst fighting game I've ever played, but when your competition is near perfect in its execution, you surely need to be better than this.
You win!
1995's Cool Riders by AM1 is one of Sega's oddest releases in the arcade. This is one of only 2 games released for the H1 arcade board, a superscaler platform that existed during the height of the Model 2's polygon renaissance. Even weirder, this is virtually a carbon copy of Outrunners, but this time with digitized assets and much more outlandish presentation. And the thing is, this game freaking rocks. It's every bit as fun as Sega's other arcade racers, and the extreme speed and crazy jumps just add to the thrills. You drive through famous cities and landmarks throughout the USA, choosing your path just like the Outrun series of games. You'll be about as likely to win the lottery as find one of these in the wild, and while it took MAME forever to emulate it right, it's finally playable for the world to see. Definitely give this one a run. It's wacky as hell, but a good ride all the same. DD Crew here was regretfully released in 1991 and developed by AM3 on the Sega System 18 arcade board. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up in the same mold as Streets of Rage, but plays much worse. The presentation is solid enough, with decent-sized characters and enough moves to make the game fun. Things fall apart with the hit detection, as you can only hit one enemy at a time, allowing the game to get in cheap hits when there are lots of enemies on the screen. Not even the jump attacks can hit more than one enemy, adding to the frustration. You can adjust to this and play it with some success, but it feels more like a chore than anything else. It also has one of the worst soundtracks I've ever heard in a Sega game, something that doesn't happen very often. I can certainly see why Sega left this one off its home machines, but if you're curious, MAME does play it just fine. The Sega System 18 hardware would be much better represented in 1992's Desert Breaker by AM1, a run-and-gun shooter in the same mold as Capcom's Mercs. Despite this being a fun and great-looking addition to the genre, Sega would not release this outside of Japan, nor port this to anything else. It's a shame too, as the invincible dash mechanic gives the game a strategic fun factor many in the genre lack. It has a fair number of power-ups to keep things interesting too, but the boss fights can be brutally difficult until you become more familiar with them. It's another one you'll need to fire up on MAME if you want to play it. "1986 Enduro Racer isn't exactly an unknown quantity. The game received a number of computer ports, as well as a showing on the Sega Master System. But the arcade variant here was a different beast altogether, using Sega's hang-on hardware to power what was essentially a dirt bike version of that game. Now added were jumps and obstacles to contend with, a natural evolution of gameplay for the genre. The arcade cabinet had a sit-down dirt bike seat with handlebars that you'd pull up on for the jumps, adding an authenticity to the experience that just kicked all sorts of ass in 1986. If you have only experienced the home versions of this one, fire it up on MAME with a good analog controller, and prepare yourself for one hell of a ride. Rail Chase was developed by AM3 and released on the Sega Y arcade board in 1991. This super-scalar shooter has the look of a light gun game, but was actually a sit-down unit with flight stick-style controllers for the weapons. Essentially a rail shooter, you basically spend the game running from enemies trying their best to kill you, and you'll need to shoot just about everything but the kitchen sink to survive. Gameplay isn't just isolated to shooting, however, as you can choose which tracks your railcar follow at many junctions during the game. Some paths will feature greater rewards such as extra health, while others will put you in danger. This was a fantastic looking game the year it was released, and the 2-player mode was a blast. Many of you may remember its sequel for the Model 2 arcade hardware, but it all started right here with this one. Sega would try their hand in the vertical shooter genre in 1987's Sonic Boom, developed by AM1. It plays surprisingly close to Raiden, another shooter that wouldn't be released until 3 years later. This game here is hard as hell, and I had a ton of trouble beating the first 2 stages. While you have the ability to power up your ship with additional satellites, they get destroyed when hit by bullets, meaning you can be powered down as quickly as you were powered up. You also have some screen-crushing power bombs to help you out in tough situations. The game's main flaw is its lack of speed, however. Enemy fire is far faster than you, making it a frustrating play. I wish Sega had tried again, because what's here isn't bad, and with a few tweaks to the formula, a sequel could have started something well worth pursuing. Almost all of us remember Afterburner and G-Lock, but in 1991, Sega AM2 would release Strike Fighter on the Y arcade board. This Japanese-only sequel to G-Lock is an awesome addition to those franchises. Played mainly from an inside-the-cockpit view, you'll blast your way through countless enemy planes and bases en route to victory. It's essentially Afterburner played from the perspective of G-Lock, and that's not a bad thing. Fast as hell and looking great, it even did away with the missile limitations of the previous games, allowing you to go hog wild and spray the horizon with your rockets oh death. Some of the content in this one would go on to be used in the Sega CD's version of Afterburner 3, but let me be quite blunt here. This arcade version shits all over that game, and is well worth your time should you pursue it. Time Scanner was Sega AM1's attempt at digital pinball. Released in 1987 on Sega's System 16 arcade hardware, this is a damn decent game of pinball here. It lacks the flash of some of the later titles like Alien Crush, but its 4 boards provide enough variety and challenge to keep you interested. Video pinball isn't a particularly popular genre, and Sega would leave this one in Japan. Some of you European guys may recognize it though, as it received a number of ports there for various computer systems. 1992's Title Fight by Sega AM3 was done on the System 32 arcade hardware and was Sega's attempt at a realistic boxing game. The arcade would use a dual joystick setup to mimic your boxing gloves, allowing you to control which hands you were using, as well as a variety of offensive and defensive moves depending on what combination of directions you were pressing. It was quite the complicated game to play the first time you tried, but after a few times, it was really something to experience. The massive sprites scaled realistically towards and away from the screen, and the dual monitors made 2-player competitive action a personal affair. It was a hard game though, and you only had one single round to defeat your opponent. A knockout was a certain victory, but far too often it went to the scorecards, leaving you to the cheating-ass mercy of the judges.
Down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Fight!
So there we go, guys, forgotten Sega arcade games. Now, there's a number of titles on this list here that I wish had gotten an accurate home port. Titles like Strike Fighter and Cool Riders were just absolutely ripe for a Sega Saturn version, but it simply wasn't meant to be. As a matter of fact, there's a number of games on this list that never even made it out of Japan, showing that while Sega was willing to try some of these genres out, they weren't willing to invest in them long term. If you want to try out these games, I recommend you get yourself a good analog controller and fire up MAME, as most of them play perfectly fine there. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you next time.